Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here to present my work. I'm Daniele Nicolella and I'm a PhD student from University of Salerno. And in this presentation, I will introduce you PRIRTEPE, an ongoing research project that investigates the relationship between educational theory and practice, especially from the perspective of students of pedagogical disciplines, future teachers and educators, and explores the possibilities of such a technical in terms to support the professional learning. I will proceed with the following steps. For first, I will frame the problem, talking about the reasons because the theory-practice relationship remains a structural issue in educational professionalization. For second, I will describe the PRIRTEPE as a research design with special attention to the heuristic strand and the questionnaire we developed. For third, I will present the idea of intervention hypothesis with a platform called PIDEA, clarify its rationale and governance principles. And for the last, I will outline the expected contribution by an empirical, methodological, and educational perspective. So, the relationship between educational theory and practice is often discussed as if it were a simple gap with too much theory and too little practice, or conversely, too much technique and too little conceptual grounding. However, the more we look at university-based training for educators and teachers, the more we realize that this is not merely a quantitative imbalance problem, but it is an epistemological and formative tension, and it leads us to question what counts as valid knowledge, how knowledge is legitimized, and how knowledge becomes actionable under contextual constraints. In many programs, students acquire a robust vocabulary of concepts, models, paradigms, theoretical frameworks, yet they frequently report difficulties when they must act in real settings in tasks like interpreting situations, making decisions, prioritizing goals, negotiating values, and corresponding to uncertainty. Conversely, in practice settings, students may adopt effective routines but struggle to articulate why they work, when they should be modified, and what assumptions they carry. This is where the notion of polite tacit knowledge becomes important. Tacit know-how is not considered a deficiency, but a constitutive dimension of professional action. Can remain unexamined and therefore resistant to critique and improvement. If professional routines are not made accessible, then professional learning risks becoming a matter of imitation, habit, or local tradition rather than reflective evidence-informed judgment. A second layer complicates the picture, that is the digital information practice. Students and early career professionals increasingly rely on online searches to solve practical uncertainties. And this is not an inherently problematic because it's obvious that the online environment can support learning and access. Yet it creates a new educational responsibility because the professional training of teachers and educators is not only in pedagogical matter, but need also a critical information literacy and technology literacy. In other words, professionals must be capable of evaluating sources, identifying weak claims, recognizing oversimplified types, and transforming knowledge into situated decisions responsibly. For reason, the project treats the theory-practice relationship as a systemic problem of professionalization and literacy, and not as a binary opposition. PRIRTEPE is an Italian acronym for Progetto di ricerca e indagine sul rapporto tra teoria e prassi in educazione, or in English, Research Project on the relationship between educational theories and practices. The project is grounded in a multi-perspective framework from experiential education, we take the idea that knowledge emerges through inquiry and experience, not a passive reception. From reflective practice, we assume that professional competence is built through iterative interpretation of situation and also rigid application of rules. From critical perspectives, we keep in view that educational action is value-laden, and the question is not only what works, but also what is educationally desirable, justifiable, and responsible. From the situated learning, we consider professional learning as participation in practices in communities shaped by cultural and situational conditions. And we can say that this framework leads to a central assumption that the theory-practice relationship is not solved by adding more internship or more lectures, but by developing forms of pedagogical, institutional, and increasingly sociotech mediation that help future teachers and educators to turn knowledge into judgment. PRIRTEPE is organized into three connected strands. First, we conducted an integrative literary review and to mapping both classic theoretical position and contemporary debates, including international scholarship on the theory-practice gap and the conditions that reproduce it in teacher education and educational work. For second, we ran an heuristic investigation, a study designed to understand how prospective professionals experience the theory-practice relationship across curricula, internship, and early work, and how they manage perceived gaps in competence. And for third, we developed an experimental strand inspired by design-based research, formulating and iteratively refine an intervention hypothesis and identify criteria for evaluating its plausibility, usability, and educational value in real contexts. Today, I will focus mainly on strand 2 and strand 3 because they explain both the diagnostic purpose of the project and its intervention horizon. Within the heuristic strand, we developed a semi-structured questionnaire composed of Likert-type items plus open-ended prompts. The instrument was supported by an expert-based process of content validation intended to ensure that items accurately reflect the construct we aim to investigate. The questionnaire we administered anonymously to more than 600 students enrolled in degree programs related to educational professions. And noteworthy, we can say that the questionnaire was not designed to simply measure satisfaction. Its purpose is to investigate a set of interrelated dimensions that together operationalize the theory-practice relationship at lead in training and early professional exposure. Specifically, the instrument explores 7 aspects: the perceived curricular emphasis, self-assessed preparedness, perceived training gaps, the transfer and contextual adaptation, the professional self-efficacy and perceived adequacy, the orientations toward digital technologies and AI in education, and last but not least, the meta-reflective feedback on the instrument itself. Analytically, PRIRTEPE combines descriptive and inferential statistics with qualitative thematic analysis of open-ended responses. We can say that this mixed approach is essential because the theory-practice relationship is partly quantifiable, but also deeply narrative, because students' description of uncertainty of attention, what counts as legitimate knowledge, often reveal mechanisms that scales alone cannot capture. PRIRTEPE does not assume that the theory-practice tension can be resolved by a single tool, but instead it asks what kind of knowledge infrastructure could support professional judgment rather than replace it. The answer for me is paideia, an Italian acronym for Piattaforma di apprendimento e istruzione digitale educativa con intelligenza artificiale, or in English, Digital Educational Learning and Instruction Platform with Artificial Intelligence. At this stage, PIDEA is explicitly hypothetical experimental solution, a project proposal that emerges from the diagnostic logic of PRIRTEPE. It is not presented as a finished product or as a magic fix, and conceptually it's designed as a digital pedagogical knowledge encyclopedia focused on the professional repertoire of methods, models, techniques, tools, and strategies with a clear definition and structured access. It is integrated with an AI conversational assistant. It cannot produce quick answers, but can scaffold the reflective inquiry. We can say that the key point is that the assistant is not substitute for the professional judgment, but a mediator that supports the user in a lot of aspects, like clarifying the educational question, making situational variables explicit, distinguishing goals for strengths and ethical consideration, comparing alternatives, and clarifying criteria of applicability, limits and trade-offs. In other words, the idea is intended to strengthen evidence literacy without turning education into a recipe-based what works mentality. Education is inherently normative, and decision must be justified not only by effectiveness claims, but by educational purposes, values, inclusion, and responsibility. Obviously, PIDEA have been governed as a socio-technical instrument, and it's designed to criteria of transparency, traceability, human oversight, and compliance with data protection principles. This because in the European context, it is also essential to align any AI-assisted educational tool with the regulatory landscape and with the international guidance on AI in education, especially regarding risk awareness, accountability, and human-centered design. Future expectations for the contribution are three. First, PRIRTEPE aims to provide an empirically grounded map of how the theory-practice relationship is experienced and navigated by future educational professionals, including how they legitimize knowledge, what they perceive as missing in training, and how digital researching and source evaluation shape their practical decision-making. This is really important because many debates about theory and practice remain ideological, and PRIRTEPE seeks to add empirical clarity to how these dynamics are lived in contemporary training environments. Second, the project contributes methodologically by developing and refining an instrument that treats the theory-practice relationship as a multidimensional construct, so not only as curriculum structure, but even with the literacy practices, judgment, or contextual adaptation. And third one, we can say the project explores ideas, interventional hypothesis, so accurate knowledge infrastructure paired with an AI-supported reflect mediator designed to strengthen professional reflexivity and situated translation on pedagogical knowledge. If the theory-practice relationship is a systemic tension, then intervention must be evaluated not only for usability, but for whether they improve the quality of professional judgment, including how professionals justify decision, evaluate information, and adapt knowledge responsibility to content. Us trying to reconnect to conference theme of the literacy of peace, we can say that PRIRTEPE frames its additional ambition as a form of epistemic peace, reducing the violence of simplification, misinformation, and technical stereotypes, and supporting cultural dialogue, rigor, and accountability in how educational professionals use knowledge and technologies. Thank you so much for your attention.